A mother noticed bruises on her daughter's arms and realized that something was wrong. She decided to find out the truth, and the way she taught her son-in-law a lesson shocked everyone. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The soft hum of the car engine echoed faintly in the quiet suburban neighborhood as Amara gazed out of the passenger window. The streets, lined with manicured lawns and pastel-colored houses, seemed like something out of a postcard. Each house was a perfect reflection of the next, neat, orderly, and picturesque. It was everything she had dreamed of when she first envisioned her future. Yet, as her eyes traced the symmetrical rows, an uneasy weight settled in her chest. "Are you even listening?" Ethan's voice cut through her thoughts. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried a sharpness that had become all too familiar. Amara flinched slightly before turning to him. "Sorry, I was just thinking." Ethan sighed, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "You need to start paying attention, Amara. This is important. First impressions matter here." She nodded quickly, her lips forming a polite, apologetic smile. "Of course, I understand." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening into what the world saw, a kind, doting husband. "I just want us to fit in, you know? This neighborhood is a great opportunity for us. We can finally settle down, start fresh." Amara forced a smile in return. "It's beautiful. I'm sure we'll be happy here." As they pulled into the driveway of their new home, Ethan leaned over and kissed her cheek. To anyone watching, it was a tender gesture, a loving husband showing affection, but Amara couldn't help but notice the way his fingers gripped her arm just a little too tightly, as if to remind her who was in control. The house was as pristine as the rest of the neighborhood, with its white shutters and carefully pruned bushes. Ethan had chosen it himself, insisting it was perfect for their future. Amara hadn't argued. She rarely did anymore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. The walls were a clean, sterile white, and the furniture, carefully arranged by the movers, looked like it had been plucked from a catalog. Ethan walked through the rooms with a proud smile, occasionally glancing back to see her reaction. "This is it," he said, spreading his arms wide in the living room. "Our home." Amara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's lovely, Ethan." He turned to her, his smile faltering just slightly. "Not lovely, Amara. Perfect. Say it's perfect." She hesitated for a moment, then forced the word out. "Perfect." His smile returned, satisfied. "See? That wasn't so hard." In the weeks that followed, Amara tried to adjust to her new life. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic. The neighbors were friendly, the streets were quiet, and the house was everything anyone could ask for. But beneath the surface, the cracks in her perfect life were already beginning to show. Ethan had always been particular, but now his demands seemed relentless. He criticized the way she cleaned, the meals she cooked, even the way she dressed. If the laundry wasn't folded exactly how he liked, he'd make her redo it. If dinner was late by even a minute, he'd remind her, in a tone that chilled her to the bone, how much he worked to provide for her. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Ethan frowned at the plate in front of him. "Is this supposed to be steak?" Amara looked at him, confused. "Yes? Is something wrong?" He picked up his fork and poked at the meat. "It's overcooked. I told you I like it medium rare." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I can make another." "It's not about the steak, Amara," he interrupted, his voice low and even. "It's about you not listening. I work hard all day, and the least you could do is get one thing right." She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll do better next time." "You'll do better now," he snapped, pushing the plate toward her. "Go make another." She rose from the table without a word, carrying the plate back to the kitchen. As she prepared a new steak, tears welled up in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. The first time he hit her, it was over something just as trivial. She had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning on her way home from the store. When she apologized, he exploded, shouting that she was useless and ungrateful. Then, before she could process what was happening, his hand came down hard across her face. The shock of it left her speechless. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek as tears filled her eyes. He stood there, breathing heavily, his hand still raised as if ready to strike again. But then, his expression changed. He looked horrified, as though he couldn't believe what he'd just done. "Amara, I'm sorry," he said, reaching out to her. "I didn't mean to." She flinched away from him, her body trembling. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched into his face. "You just make me so angry sometimes." Amara stared at him, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't who he was. He was kind, loving. Wasn't he? He took a step closer, his voice softening. "You know I love you, right? I need you to do better. For us." She nodded slowly, the words catching in her throat. "I know. I'll do better." That night, as she lay in bed, her cheeks still throbbing from the blow, she stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that it wouldn't happen again. But deep down, she already knew the truth. By the time they had been in the new house for a month, Amara had learned to walk on eggshells around Ethan. She memorized his routines, his moods, and his triggers. She became an expert at avoiding conflict, but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. There was always something wrong, something she did or didn't do that set him off. And when he drank, it was even worse. The insults came faster, the blows harder. She began to wear long sleeves even in the warmest weather, hiding the bruises that dotted her arms. She avoided phone calls from her mother, terrified that Glow would hear something in her voice that she couldn't explain. Her world shrank to the size of the house and the man who ruled it. She was no longer Amara, the vibrant, intelligent woman she once was. She was just his, a silent shadow in the perfect shell of a life. Amara woke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the bedroom curtains. For a brief moment, in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, she forgot where she was. The silence of the house felt peaceful, almost comforting. But then her eyes fell on the empty space beside her in bed, and the memories of the night before came rushing back. Ethan hadn't come home until late. He'd been drinking. She could smell the sharp tang of alcohol on his breath even before he stumbled through the door. The confrontation had started immediately, sparked by something as minor as the way she had folded the towels. His words were cruel, laced with bitterness and resentment, and when she tried to defend herself, he'd grabbed her arm so hard it left a bruise. She hadn't fought back. She never did. She sat up slowly, wincing at the soreness in her wrist. The faint purple outline of his fingers was already beginning to darken. Her heart sank as she ran her fingers over the mark, knowing it wouldn't be the last. Downstairs, she could hear the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Ethan was awake. She stood, carefully smoothing the wrinkles from her nightgown, and made her way to the bathroom to check her reflection. The bruise on her wrist was the only visible sign of last night's altercation, but her face told a different story. Her eyes were dull, her skin pale, and the faint shadows under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and restless dreams. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever mood Ethan might be in. There was no point in avoiding him. Avoiding only made him angrier. In the kitchen, Ethan was standing by the sink, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said quietly. He didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny. Finally, he said, "You should have gotten up earlier. The coffee's cold." "I'll make a fresh pot," she offered quickly, moving toward the counter. "It's fine," he snapped, setting the cup down with a clatter. "Just sit down." Amara hesitated but obeyed, pulling out a chair at the small kitchen table. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table's surface. Iden sat across from her, leaning back in his chair as he studied her. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a moment. "Is there something you're not telling me?" She shook her head. "No, I'm just tired, that's all." "Tired," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "You're home all day. What do you have to be tired about?" Amara's fingers tightened around the hem of her robe. "I've been cleaning and running errands." "Cleaning?" He cut her off with a harsh laugh. "You call this clean?" He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen where a single plate sat in the sink. "You've been slacking, Amara. I'm not blind." "I'll do better," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always say that," he muttered, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, making her flinch. "I don't want promises, Amara. I want results." He left the room without another word, and she let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her chest. The storm had passed, for now. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and silence. Amara moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, organizing shelves that didn't need organizing. It was easier to keep busy, to focus on the small mundane tasks, than to let her mind wander to the bruises on her wrist or the sharpness in Ethan's voice. As evening fell, she found herself standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes from dinner. Ethan was in the living room, the faint sound of the television drifting into the kitchen. She glanced towards the doorway, her pulse quickening. She hated these moments, the quiet before the next inevitable fight. She never knew what would set him off, what small misstep would ignite his anger. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she turned to see Ethan entering with a bottle of whiskey in hand. He set it on the counter with a thud, his eyes bloodshot and his expression dark. "Pour me a drink," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amara nodded, quickly reaching for a glass. Her hands trembled as she unscrewed the cap, the smell of alcohol stinging her nose. She handed him the glass, and he downed it in one gulp before thrusting it back toward her. "Another?" She obeyed, her heart pounding in her chest. The evening stretched on in tense silence as he continued to drink, his mood growing darker with each passing hour. By the time he stumbled to bed, she was left standing in the kitchen, her body trembling and her mind racing with thoughts she didn't dare voice. That night, as she lay in bed, Amara stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and longing. She thought of her mother, of the warm embrace and soothing words that had once been her refuge. She thought of calling her, of finally telling her the truth. But the thought of Ethan finding out, of what he might do, was enough to silence her. Instead, she whispered a silent prayer into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "Please, let this end." But deep down, She knew prayers wouldn't save her. Only she could save herself. And yet, the chains of fear that bound her seemed unbreakable. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the quiet house, pulling Amara from her thoughts. She had been sitting in the living room, absently folding laundry, her mind drifting to the weight of the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves. Visitors were rare, almost non-existent, since Ethan had insisted they keep their privacy. The sudden chime sent a jolt through her chest. She stood hesitantly, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor as she approached the door. Peering through the peephole, her breath caught. On the porch stood her mother, Gloria, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of concern and determination. Amara's hand froze on the doorknob. She hadn't spoken to her mother in weeks, not since Ethan had intercepted one of Gloria's calls and accused her of trying to interfere. He had made it clear that Gloria wasn't welcome. But now, standing just on the other side of the door, was the woman who had always been her safe harbor. Another knock broke her paralysis. "Amara, it's me," Gloria's voice called, firm but kind. Amara opened the door, forcing a shaky smile. "Mama, what are you doing here?" Gloria stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. "What kind of question is that?" "I came to see my daughter. You've been dodging my calls, and I knew something was wrong." Amara closed the door behind her, her hands nervously twisting together. "I've just been busy, Mama. Things have been hectic." Gloria turned to face her, her expression softening. "Busy? Too busy for your own mother?" She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Amara's face. Her hand paused as her eyes landed on the faint bruise peeking out from under Amara's sleeve. "What's this?" Amara instinctively pulled her arm back, tugging her sleeve down to cover the mark. "It's nothing. I was clumsy, that's all." Gloria's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. "Clumsy? Amara, don't lie to me." "I'm not lying," Amara said quickly, but her voice wavered. I tripped and hit the edge of the counter. It's not a big deal." Gloria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Amara, I've known you your whole life. I can see when you're hiding something. You've always been terrible at lying." Amara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of magazines on the coffee table. "I'm fine, Mama, really." Gloria watched her for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Where's Ethan?" she finally asked, her tone deceptively calm. "He's at work," Amara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Gloria said, setting her purse down on the couch, "because we need to talk." They sat in the kitchen, the tension between them palpable. Amara avoided her mother's gaze, staring down at the untouched cup of tea in front of her. Gloria, however, kept her eyes fixed on her daughter, her expression unreadable. "Amara," Gloria began, her voice steady, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Is Ethan hurting you?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Amara's hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles turning white. "Mama, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Gloria said firmly, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my daughter is living in fear." "Ethan loves me," Amara said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He gets stressed sometimes. Work is hard and—" "Stop," Gloria interrupted, her voice cutting through Amara's excuses. "Don't you dare justify his behavior. Love doesn't leave bruises, Amara. Love doesn't make you scared to speak or to be yourself." Amara's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like a child again, small and vulnerable. "You don't understand, Mama. If I leave, he'll find me. He always finds a way." Gloria reached across the table, taking Amara's hands in hers. "You're my daughter, and I will never let anyone hurt you. Do you hear me? No matter what it takes, we'll get you out of this." Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away. "It's not that simple. He knows people. He says no one will believe me if I tell them. He's right, Mama. Who's going to listen to a black woman over a white man in this town?" Gloria's jaw tightened, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I will, and if I have to, I'll make them listen. But first, you need to let me help you." The sound of the front door opening sent a jolt through Amara. She froze, her eyes wide with panic as Ethan's voice echoed through the house. "Amara, I'm home." Gloria stood, her movements calm and deliberate. "Stay here," she said quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Amara watched helplessly as her mother walked into the living room to face Ethan. She could hear their voices, low and tense, but she couldn't make out the words. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to intervene, to stop whatever confrontation was unfolding, but her legs refused to move. After what felt like an eternity, the voices grew louder, and Ethan stormed into the kitchen, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "What the hell is this, Amara?" he demanded, gesturing toward Gloria, who stood behind him with her arms crossed. "Why is she here?" "I invited her," Amara said softly, her voice trembling. "You had no right," he snapped. "This is my house. I don't need her sticking her nose in our business." Gloria stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Your house? Last I checked, my daughter lives here too. And if you think I'm going to sit back and let you treat her like this, you've got another thing coming." Ethan turned to face her, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about, lady. You're just causing trouble." Gloria's gaze didn't waver. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm not leaving until I know my daughter is safe." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Ethan glared at Gloria, his fists clenched at his sides, but she stood her ground, her presence a quiet, unyielding force. Finally, he turned on his heel and left the room, slamming the door to his study behind him. Gloria let out a slow breath, then turned to Amara. "Pack a bag," she said softly. "We're leaving." Amara hesitated, her fear still outweighing her hope. But as she looked into her mother's eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt in a long time: strength. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The air in the house felt electric, charged with tension that made every sound sharper, every movement heavier. Amara sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Gloria stood near the window, her posture calm but commanding. Her mother's presence was a balm and a spark all at once, soothing Amara's frayed nerves but igniting a fire in the pit of her stomach. For the first time, Amara dared to imagine a life without fear. The quiet was broken by the sharp creak of a door opening. Ethan stepped into the living room, his presence like a storm cloud rolling in. His face was calm, too calm, but his jaw was tight and his fists were clenched at his sides. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze flickering between Amara and Gloria. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, his voice low and controlled. "This is my house, and I don't appreciate uninvited guests." Gloria turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "And I thought I made myself clear too. I'm here for my daughter." Ethan's lips curled into a tight smile. Your daughter doesn't need rescuing. She's fine, aren't you, Amara? Amara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the unspoken threat in his words. But then she glanced at her mother, who gave her a slight nod, her expression steady and unyielding. I'm not fine, Amara said softly, her voice trembling but firm. I'm not fine, and I'm not safe. Ethan's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. You don't know what you're saying. She's been emotional lately, he said, addressing Gloria now. You know how women can get. Gloria raised an eyebrow, her arms crossing over her chest. Don't you dare patronize me, boy. I know exactly what's going on here, and I know what kind of man you are. Ethan's composure cracked for a moment, his lips twitching with barely restrained anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Gloria stepped closer, her voice sharp and unwavering. I've seen the bruises on her arms. I've heard the fear in her voice. You think you can hide what you've done, but you're not as clever as you think. Amara watched as Ethan's face darkened, his calm exterior crumbling. She had seen this look before, just before his rage boiled over. Her body tensed instinctively, readying for the storm. You don't know anything about our marriage, Ethan snapped, his voice rising. Amara and I are fine. She's just dramatic, always making a big deal out of nothing. Gloria's laugh was cold and cutting. Nothing? Is that what you call the bruises? The fear in her eyes every time you walk into the room? You're a coward, Ethan. A weak little boy who thinks he can feel powerful by breaking someone else. Ethan took a step forward, his face twisted with fury. You better watch your mouth. Gloria didn't flinch. She held her ground, her eyes locked on his. Or what? You'll hit me? Go ahead and try. But you won't, will you? Because bullies like you only pick on people you think won't fight back. Amara's breath hitched as she watched the exchange. She had never seen anyone stand up to Ethan like this. He looked smaller now, his bravado shrinking under her mother's unwavering gaze. You're out of line, Ethan said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. This is my house, and I won't have you disrespecting me in it. Gloria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Your house? The only reason you have this house is because my daughter trusted you. She believed in you, and you repaid her by tearing her down piece by piece. But that stops now. Ethan's face turned red, and for a moment Amara thought he might explode. But then he stepped back, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just waltz in here and take her away from me? She's my wife. She's not your property, Gloria shot back. And yes, I can, because no man, especially not a coward like you, has the right to treat her like this. Amara felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest, fear, relief, and something that felt like hope. For so long, she had believed that Ethan's power over her was absolute, but seeing her mother stand up to him, seeing the cracks in his facade, made her realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invincible as he seemed. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Gloria remained calm, her presence steady and immovable. Ethan's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he glared at her, his mind clearly racing. You're making a mistake, he said finally, his voice low and venomous. You don't know what you're getting into. Gloria tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. Oh, I know exactly what I'm getting into. The real question is, do you... Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Gloria held up a hand, silencing him. Here's what's going to happen. Amara is leaving with me. If you so much as try to stop her, I will make sure every single one of your neighbors knows exactly what kind of man you are. And if you ever lay a hand on her again, you'll be dealing with me. Do you understand?" Ethan stared at her, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door to his study behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Amara felt her entire body relax as the tension drained away, replaced by a sense of relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Gloria turned to her, her expression softening. "Go pack a bag," she said gently. "We're leaving." Amara hesitated, her fear still lingering. "What if he won't," Gloria interrupted. "Not this time, not ever again." Amara nodded, her movements slow and deliberate as she made her way upstairs. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. Amara sat on the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the faintly floral-patterned wallpaper that hadn't changed in years. The familiar room felt both comforting and alien, like a distant memory she wasn't quite ready to revisit. She had always thought of this space as a safe haven, a place where she could escape the world's chaos, but now it felt too small, too fragile to hold the weight of her truth. Gloria sat across from her, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Her eyes were steady, filled with a quiet determination that both reassured and terrified Amara. There was no judgment in her mother's gaze, only patience and an unyielding promise of support. The kind of support Amara hadn't realized she still needed until now. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a sound Amara remembered well, one that had lulled her to sleep as a child. Now it seemed impossibly loud, a reminder of the passing time she couldn't reclaim. "Amara," Gloria said gently, breaking the silence, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe here. I just need you to talk to me." Amara's hands trembled in her lap as she tried to find the words. They stuck in her throat, heavy and jagged, refusing to come out. She glanced down at the faint bruises on her wrist, the ones she had tried so hard to hide, even now. "I don't know where to start," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Start with what's been happening," Gloria said. "Start with the truth." The truth? It sounded so simple, yet it felt like the most impossible thing in the world. For years, she had buried it deep, covering it with excuses and justifications until she had almost convinced herself it wasn't real. But sitting here, under her mother's unwavering gaze, the lies began to unravel. "Ethan wasn't always like this," Amara began, her voice trembling. "When we met, he was different, kind, charming. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the world." Gloria nodded, waiting patiently for her to continue. "He told me all the things I wanted to hear," Amara said, her words picking up speed as the dam began to break. "That I was beautiful, that I was smart, that I was special. He said he loved me for who I was, that he didn't care about what anyone else thought." "But," Gloria prompted gently. "But it didn't last," Amara admitted, her voice cracking. "After we got married, everything changed. He became controlling. At first, it was small things, telling me what to wear, what to eat, who I could talk to. I thought it was because he cared, because he wanted the best for me. But then it got worse." She paused, her breath hitching as memories she had tried to suppress flooded back. "He started criticizing everything I did. The way I cleaned the house, the way I cooked, even the way I talked. Nothing was ever good enough for him. And when I tried to stand up for myself, he'd get angry. Really angry." Gloria's hands clenched in her lap, but she didn't interrupt. "The first time he hit me, I couldn't believe it," Amara continued, tears streaming down her face now. "I told myself it was an accident, that he didn't mean it. He said he was sorry, that he loved me, that it wouldn't happen again. And I believed him." "But it did," Gloria said quietly. Amara nodded, her shoulders shaking. "It got worse. The insults, the threats, the way he'd call me names, awful names. He'd say things like, 'You're lucky I even looked at you,' or 'No one else would ever want someone like you.' He'd remind me that I was just a black girl who didn't belong in his world." Her voice broke and Gloria reached out, taking her hands in a firm but gentle grip. "And you believed him?" Amara nodded again, her tears falling freely. "I didn't know what else to believe. He made me feel so small, so worthless. I started to think maybe he was right." Gloria's jaw tightened, her anger palpable, but her voice remained steady. "He's wrong, Amara. Every single word he said was a lie. You are not small, you are not worthless, and you damn sure don't deserve what he did to you." Amara let out a shaky breath, her chest aching from the weight of her confession. "I was so scared, Mama. Every time I thought about leaving, he'd find a way to remind me that I couldn't, that no one would believe me. He said people would take his side because he's white and I'm not." Gloria's grip on her hands tightened. "He underestimated you, and he underestimated me." For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of Amara's words hanging heavy in the room. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a space to breathe, to heal. "You did the right thing by telling me," Gloria said finally. "I know it wasn't easy, but you're stronger than you think, Amara. And now that I know the truth, we can start to fix this." Amara looked at her, a flicker of hope in her tear-streaked eyes. "What if he tries to come after me?" "Let him try," Gloria said, her voice steely. "He doesn't scare me, and he won't scare you either, not anymore. We'll take this one step at a time. But first, you need to know that you're not alone in this. You never were." Amara nodded slowly, the truth of her mother's words sinking in. For so long, she had carried the burden of her pain alone, convinced that no one would understand, that no one could help. But now, sitting across from Gloria, she realized she had been wrong. That night, as she lay in the bed she had once considered her sanctuary, Amara felt a strange sense of calm. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The morning light crept through the curtains of Gloria's living room, illuminating the modest space with a soft golden hue. Amara sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic. Her body was still, but her mind raced. She replayed the conversation with her mother over and over again, each word bringing both relief and dread. Telling Gloria the truth had been liberating, but the thought of what might come next was suffocating. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Gloria entered the room, her presence as commanding as ever, holding a small notebook and a pen. She placed them on the table in front of Amara. "We're making a plan," Gloria said firmly. Amara looked up, her brow furrowing. "A plan?" "Yes," Gloria replied, sitting down across from her. "We're not going to wait for him to make the next move. We're going to take control of this situation. I've already made a few calls." Amara's stomach churned at the thought of involving anyone else. "Calls to who?" "To people who can help us," Gloria said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "A lawyer, for one, and a friend of mine who works with women in situations like yours." Amara's first instinct was to protest, to say that it was too much, too soon. But the look in Gloria's eyes stopped her. Her mother wasn't just determined, she was certain. For the first time in years, Amara felt the weight of her fear lighten, just a little. Later that afternoon, Gloria drove them into town. The trip was purposeful, each destination carefully planned. First, they stopped at a small law office, where Gloria introduced Amara to a sharp-eyed woman named Judith. She specialized in cases involving domestic abuse, and her confidence was infectious. "You're doing the right thing," Judith said as she slid a stack of forms across the desk. "The first step is always the hardest, but you've already taken it." Amara nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she began to fill out the paperwork. Each stroke of the pen felt like an act of defiance, a small but significant rebellion against the control Ethan had held over her. Their next stop was the police station. Amara's heart pounded as she walked through the doors, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the sterile walls. Gloria stayed by her side as they spoke to an officer, recounting the years of abuse and providing the details Judith had told them to document. The officer's face remained neutral as he took notes, but Amara couldn't help but feel exposed under his gaze. She kept her eyes on Gloria, drawing strength from her mother's steady presence. "You're doing great," Gloria said softly as they left the station. "One step at a time." By the time they returned home, the sun was beginning to set. Amara felt drained, her body heavy with exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was a flicker of something new: empowerment. She had taken steps to protect herself, to reclaim her life, and it felt good. As she and Gloria sat down to dinner, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the fragile calm. Amara's blood ran cold as she recognized the deep rumble of Ethan's engine. Gloria rose from her seat, her expression unreadable. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice firm. "But Mama," Amara began, panic rising in her chest. "Stay here," Gloria repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Amara's heart raced as she watched her mother stride to the front door. The sharp knock came seconds before Gloria opened it, revealing Ethan standing on the porch. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and his jaw clenched. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Gloria stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "She's safe. That's all you need to know." "Safe?" Ethan sneered. "She's my wife. I have every right to see her." Gloria's eyes narrowed. "You lost that right the moment you put your hands on her." "You don't know what you're talking about," Ethan growled, taking a step closer. "This is none of your business." "It became my business the moment you hurt my daughter," Gloria shot back. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "And let me make one thing very clear. If you try to come near her again, you'll regret it." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "What are you going to do? Call the cops? Go ahead. They won't believe you. No one ever does." Gloria took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "That's where you're wrong. We've already filed a report. We have photos, documentation, and witnesses. So go ahead, Ethan. Test me. But I promise you, you won't like the outcome." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. His face was a mask of fury, his chest heaving with every breath. Amara watched from the window, her heart pounding as she waited for his next move. Finally, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his car, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed through the quiet street. The tires screeched as he sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Gloria stepped back inside, her expression calm but resolute. She closed the door and locked it before turning to face Amara. "Is he gone?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," Gloria replied. She walked over and placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "But don't worry, baby. He's not coming back. Not if I have anything to say about it." Amara nodded, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The fear lingered, but it was no longer paralyzing. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she could stand up to Ethan and win. The days following Ethan's confrontation at Gloria's house were a whirlwind of activity and tension. Gloria worked tirelessly, coordinating with Judith, the lawyer, and staying in close contact with the local police. Amara, though still anxious and fearful, began to feel the stirrings of hope. She had a long way to go, but she wasn't alone anymore. The first major step was securing a restraining order against Ethan. Judith handled the paperwork, navigating the legal system with precision. Amara had to recount every instance of abuse in painstaking detail, her voice trembling as she relived the worst moments of her life. Gloria sat beside her the entire time, her hand resting on Amara's for support. The police were slow to act at first, hesitant to intervene in what some still called domestic disputes. But Judith's firm insistence, combined with the evidence Gloria had collected, photos of bruises, text messages laced with threats, and Amara's own testimony, finally prompted action. By the time the restraining order was filed, Ethan's fury had reached a boiling point. The first sign of trouble came late one night. Amara and Gloria were sitting in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, when the sound of a car engine rumbled outside. Amara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Gloria stood immediately, her expression hardening. "Stay here," she ordered, grabbing her phone as she headed for the door. Amara couldn't obey this time. She followed her mother to the window, her hands trembling as she peeked out through the curtains. Ethan was standing in the driveway, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the porch light. He looked wild. His hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his movements erratic. He pounded on the door, his voice slurred but loud. "Amara, I know you're in there. Open this damn door." Gloria stepped in front of the door, her phone already dialing the police. "You're not coming in here, Ethan," she called through the door, her voice steady and unshaken. "She's my wife," he roared. "You can't keep her from me." "She's not your property," Gloria shot back. "And if you don't leave right now, you'll be explaining yourself to the police." Ethan's fists hit the door again, harder this time, rattling it on its hinges. Amara flinched at the sound, her body instinctively curling in on itself. But then she looked at her mother, standing tall and unyielding, and something shifted inside her. "No," Amara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She took a step toward the door. "He doesn't get to control me anymore." Gloria glanced back at her, concern flashing in her eyes. "Amara, you don't have to—" "I do," Amara interrupted, her hands clenching into fists. "He needs to hear it from me." Amara unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the porch. The cool night air bit at her skin, but she didn't falter. Ethan's bloodshot eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the familiar fear clawed at her chest. But then she thought of everything she had endured, everything he had taken from her, and the fear was replaced by anger. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "You're not welcome here, Ethan." He took a step toward her, his expression a mix of rage and desperation. "Amara, you don't mean that. I know you're scared, but we can fix this. We can go back to the way things were." Her laughter was sharp and bitter. "The way things were? You mean the lies, the control, the abuse?" "No, Ethan, we're done." "You can't do this to me," he growled, his hands balling into fists. "You're my wife. You're supposed to stand by me." Amara shook her head, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I stood by you for years. I forgave you when you hurt me. I believed your lies because I thought it would get better. But it didn't. And I'm done waiting for a change that's never going to come." Ethan's face twisted in fury. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" "They already do," Amara said, her voice rising. "The police know, the court knows, and I know. You don't have power over me anymore, Ethan." At that moment, the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the driveway, their sirens cutting through the tension. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they approached. "Sir, step away from the porch," one of them ordered. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced between Amara and the officers. "She's my wife," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "I have a right to talk to her." "Not under a restraining order," the officer replied, pulling out a copy of the document. "You've been served, and you're in violation. Step away, or we'll arrest you." For a moment, Ethan looked like he might resist, but then his shoulders slumped and the fight seemed to drain out of him. The officers led him to the car, handcuffing him as Amara watched in silence. When the police car disappeared down the street, Amara turned to Gloria, her body trembling with adrenaline. Gloria stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. "You did it," Gloria said softly. "You stood up to him." Amara nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Ethan was gone, and she was finally free. Later that night, as Amara lay in bed, she replayed the events in her mind. The fear, the anger, the triumph. She had spent so long believing she was powerless, but now she knew the truth. She was stronger than she had ever realized, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her again. The road ahead would still be hard, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But Amara was ready to face it. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Gloria's living room, casting a warm glow across the space. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amara woke without the crushing weight of fear pressing down on her chest. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of birds outside. It was a quiet she hadn't realized she missed, one that didn't feel oppressive but peaceful. She sat up in bed, stretching her arms as she let out a soft sigh. The events of the past few weeks played through her mind like a vivid reel. The confession to Gloria, the confrontation with Ethan, and the night he was finally taken away by the police. It was surreal, as if it had all happened to someone else. But it hadn't. It had happened to her, and she had survived. In the kitchen, Gloria was already up, standing by the stove with a spatula in hand. The smell of frying eggs and bacon filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Amara paused in the doorway, watching her mother move with a practiced ease. "You're up early," Gloria said without turning around, her tone warm and teasing. "I thought I'd have to drag you out of bed." Amara smiled faintly as she stepped into the room, pulling out a chair at the small kitchen table. I couldn't sleep. My mind's been busy." Gloria turned, placing a plate of food in front of her. "That's to be expected. You've been through a lot, baby. It's going to take time to adjust." "I know," Amara said quietly, picking up her fork. "It's just strange. I feel like I should still be looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up. But he's gone. Really gone." Gloria sat across from her, her expression softening. "He is. And he's not coming back. You made sure of that." The pride in her mother's voice brought a lump to Amara's throat. She hadn't felt proud of herself in years, not since before Ethan had slowly chipped away at her confidence, leaving her a shadow of who she once was. But now, sitting here with her mother, she felt the faint stirrings of pride again. She had fought back. She had reclaimed her life. Later that day, Amara sat by the window, a notebook and pen resting in her lap. The page in front of her was blank, but her mind was alive with thoughts and emotions, all clamoring to be expressed. Gloria had suggested she start journaling, a way to process everything she had been through. At first, Amara had resisted, unsure of what to write or how to begin. But now, as she stared at the blank page, the words began to flow. She wrote about the first time she met Ethan, about how charming and attentive he had been. She wrote about the small signs she had ignored, the way he spoke about other women, the subtle criticisms disguised as jokes. She wrote about the turning point when his love had turned to control, then to violence. And finally, she wrote about her escape. The courage it had taken to tell her mother to stand up to him, to reclaim her voice. By the time she put the pen down, the page was full, her handwriting messy and hurried but unmistakably hers. She felt lighter, as if each word had lifted a piece of the burden she had been carrying for so long. A week later, Gloria took her to a local support group for survivors of domestic abuse. The meeting was held in a cozy community center, the walls adorned with colorful artwork and inspirational quotes. Amara hesitated at the door, her nerves getting the better of her. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready," Gloria assured her. "Just listen. That's enough." Amara nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was filled with women of all ages and backgrounds, each with their own story of pain and resilience. As the meeting began, Amara listened intently, her heart aching at the raw honesty in their voices. She saw pieces of herself in their stories, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. But then she thought of Gloria, of the strength and love that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life. She thought of the women in the room, their bravery and vulnerability, and she began to speak. "My name is Amara," she said, her voice shaken but steady, "and I'm a survivor." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She felt the weight of them, the truth of them, settle over her like a warm blanket. For so long, she had seen herself as a victim, powerless and broken. But now, she saw herself as something else entirely. In the months that followed, Amara began to rebuild her life. She found a small apartment in the city, filled it with plants and second-hand furniture, and made it her own. She reconnected with old friends, people she had distanced herself from during her marriage, and built a new support system. She even began volunteering at the support group, helping other women find their strength and their voice. One evening, as she sat on the couch with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a text from Gloria. "Proud of you, baby. Always." Amara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing was a lifelong journey. but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. She had her mother, her friends, and most importantly, herself. For the first time in years, Amara felt free. Not just from Ethan, but from the fear and self-doubt that had held her captive for so long. She was free to dream, to love, to live, and she wasn't going to waste a single moment of it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories and content like this. Share this video with friends who might find it inspiring, and check out more of our videos to keep the conversation going. See you next time.